I finished Scorn, and I really wanted to like it. I think this game is really going to land with a few select groups of gamers that are after something specific. But if you fall outside that group, then it's going to be a doozy for most of you. But will you like it? Hopefully by the end of this video, you will know. I finished it, so here's my review of Scorn. Scorn delivers immensely on an atmospheric world the likes of which I have never seen in a video game. Drawing inspiration from Swedish artist H.R. Giger, whose art depicts the cold intersection of man and machine with a healthy focus on reproduction, which is found everywhere in Scorn. This inspiration gives way to a cold, dead mechanical world where tasks are carried out with the efficiency and tenderness a set of mechanical production robots might afford. A large part of my desire to play this game came from this very art style and how this game could embody the fantasy of wandering around a Promethean ship from the Alien series. The Alien series being where most people will have likely intersected with Giger's work. As you progress through Scorn, you will begin to notice parts of the world are covered in this growth that clogs up the gears and grinds to a halt the careful precision of the factory world around you. This biological parasite shows the game's other main point of inspiration, the work of Zdzisław Beksiński, art that portrays a more fungal and skeletal nature to man and their relation to death. The machines that hum around you are covered in this growth, which has pushed its way into where it does not belong and taken over, growing a host of fleshy beings to protect its advance, which the player will need to overcome. Combining this art with the atmospherics of constant haze, twisting corridors that wrap around large open spaces, cinematic hums and drones, and a good dose of body horror from the many orifices that the player will slide their appendages into, create a vision for this world that is constant, hard to escape, and dripping with detail. This is by far the best part of the game and what you should be considering the most when you're deciding whether or not you want to play it. How much is this aesthetic driving your purchase decision? How well are you going to gel with this aesthetic? Because Scorn commits to it wholeheartedly, rarely if ever straying from it in the 6 or so hours it might take you to finish this game. While navigating the world of Scorn, you will encounter 3 main types of gameplay. Maybe 4 depending on your idea of gameplay. The first kind of gameplay, and often the first asked of the player, is to determine the puzzle box that makes up the level and decipher how they might bend the world around them to progress. Levels often feature a large mechanism to use that is made up of smaller mechanisms, and figuring out this large level-sized mechanism and what state it needs to be in is what's providing the player their main objective. You might need to move something from one place to another to allow you to open a door. You might need to clear the invading red goo to clear a path. Often you will need to use the second type of gameplay. The second type of gameplay is a varied assortment of smaller local puzzles that unlock specific mechanisms. These puzzles are often simple and not too far from puzzles that are found in other games. They provide a welcome variety from the other types of gameplay and range from fairly simple timing puzzles to more complex multiple moving parts puzzles like these spinning dials. There are actually quite a few of these types of puzzles strewn across the game, and none of them overstay their welcome, keeping each area fresh and challenging the player in new ways across their journey. Through these 2 sizes of puzzles, the player will slowly get the level's puzzle box into the place it needs to be, but that's if you don't run into trouble with the level layouts. Scorn explicitly tells the player very little through the entire game. There are no pop-up explanations, no tutorials, no companion characters to explain things that you are already halfway through doing. The best you get is some basic HUD for all the necessities and this controls layout in the pause menu. There is a run button. You will need it. Don't take 40 minutes to find it like I did. Because of this desire to stay silent, the player is left entirely on their own to do as they please and devise their own goals. This also means, however, the player is left to figure everything out themselves, leading me back to the layouts and the design. I'm calling this a type of gameplay worth talking about because I'm not sure you would consider finding a way around the space gameplay. For Breath of the Wild, I would, but for Call of Duty, I wouldn't. To this point, the design of Scorn's levels seems to be leaning into the idea of feeling alien and inhuman to further amplify the atmosphere. Spaces overlap and double back on themselves. Corridors that were originally built in nice, straight Promethean lines are blocked by damage, decay, or flesh, and surfaces and spaces curve and twist in a way foreign to many other games, where humans of those other universes or level designers from studios prioritize usability and guidance. Traditional or maybe contemporary level design will employ a large bag of tricks and tactics to hint at your next objective. Scorn forgoes much of this logic to keep you feeling lost and confused in service of the setting, only using light and some other basics sparingly to inform the player. What this ends up being in game is lots of wandering around these beautiful, would you say beautiful? Wandering around these beautiful spaces looking for a way forward or a place where the interaction circle turns white. I can see many players having trouble working out what to do because the game isn't willing to tell them, and certain spaces are unforgiving in their layout. This will without a doubt frustrate certain players. I personally experienced this in the first level. I had got an item that I needed to progress, but then I needed to scour the level to find where to put it. You can see this large space with several rooms off the main chamber, and there's a second floor with a decent amount of other corridors to it also. I spent probably 10 minutes running around checking everything 3 times. Everything except the one place that I needed to go, which was this machine. And sure, it's pretty lit up, but so many of the other things are across all of the different rooms that I could access. For the rest of the game, I found the layout fairly intuitive to understand, mostly just go forward into the place that you haven't been yet, but there were definitely sections where I got turned around, and while I knew where to go or roughly what to look for, I wasn't sure how to get there, and I could definitely see where this might trip up others, or where things were definitely not clear. While going through all of these 3 types of gameplay, you will also be held up by the soldiers of the red growth, horrid beings grown out of the red goo lining the environments the player passes through. And as your mere presence threatens their host, you will find them attacking you, and in retaliation, you will need to fight back. Which brings us to combat. Combat in Scorn is... yeah, it's pretty rough. Scorn has a small range of guns the player collects along their journey. There is also a small range of enemies the player will fight. Combat systems in games like Scorn, where combat is more of a pacing and puzzle mechanic than a core gameplay system, are always hard to get right. I think the implementation in Scorn is a fair crack at a working system that fits this particular game. Later in the game, where you have a few weapons, it becomes a little more free-flowing, as you have more options and maybe you've saved some ammo from previous encounters. But the entire combat system suffers many clunky, fatal flaws that make it just unfun and janky to engage with early in the game, and it pushes the player into these boring gameplay loops to work around the kinks in the gunplay. The first gun you get is this peony poker. You get taught shortly after picking this up that it can be used to essentially melee enemies. Is YouTube going to yellow circle me for this? But it only has 2 strikes before you need to spend quite a while recharging. When you hit actual combat, you run into these worm things. These guys take 5 hits to kill, so at best, you will need to recharge your peony poker twice. All enemies in Scorn are quite accurate with their attacks, so you can either strafe them, or you can stay at very long range. Strafing for me was a gamble, because of how accurate everything is, so playing at range means you need to run in and engage, and then run and hide 3 times to kill one of these worm enemies. This isn't so bad when there is just one enemy, but soon enough, multiple enemies are thrown at the player, and if they can flank you, the player is almost certainly going to take a few hits of damage. To add to this, all weapons in the game have a substantial draw time to ready for their first attack, making it basically a perfect timing exercise to run in and hit the enemy before taking a hit yourself. The peony poker is also terribly inaccurate and really difficult to gauge the effective range of the weapon. The enemies themselves writhe and flail. Some enemies like this chicken thing jump side to side, and when you add getting up close to the draw time, slowing your controls, and reducing your field of view, and maybe being just out of range, you are quite often going to miss that first poke. And that turns combat encounters into these awkward, fumbling exchanges where you are trying not to get hit, but the enemies are super accurate, but anytime you get close, it's pretty tough to get in 2 good solid shots without taking your time and maybe eating damage as you aim. And then you need to flee to recharge and avoid further damage. Ultimately, what all this leads to is meta gameplay patterns like corner hiding and popping out, or kiting enemies around objects in the environment to avoid a lock-on because you can't reliably engage front-on. Add to this the health and checkpointing system, and you can end up in some situations where the odds are just stacked against you. Checkpointing in this game is brutal, sometimes setting you back multiple combat encounters and also undoing your progress in a more traditional implementation, meaning that you need to do things over again. If it's your first run through a level and you are figuring things out, you might get swarmed unexpectedly, die, and have 5 or even 10 minutes of your progress undone. Health is also a little tricky, as it's dispensed from these units that fill up these bubbles that heal you after an animation. This means that if you have a particularly unfortunate combat encounter, you might have to do the next few encounters with little to no health, also not knowing when the next health station is. Combine this with the checkpointing system, and you can get caught with 1 health and no means of increasing it unless you perfectly dispatch the next however many combat encounters without taking a single hit of damage. And this legit happened to me. The amount of times that I watched this animation play as my progress was set each time I failed to kill the 7th or 8th enemy. Cringe. Later in the game, combat does open up. You get a pistol and a shotgun style weapon, and this opens up a resource game where you need to consider what very scarce ammo there is to be found and what enemies to use it on. The game rarely gives you enough ammo to just kill everything that lies between you and the next ammo refill though, so it's imperative that you choose your battles wisely or you will end up in the same place we just went through with just the peony poker. These options do empower the player to take combat more head-on when desired, however, and this does ease some of the problems in the early game. Ultimately, I think the developers were trying to find a system of combat that meant the player would need to manage resources, find combat challenging, and just not breeze through combat encounters, but what they landed on was awkward and promotes bad gameplay patterns. The other possible goal I could speculate on might have been a much more horror-inspired idea that you aren't supposed to kill every enemy. This is how I ended up playing the game. The early game combat and the checkpointing was so excruciating that I just said I'm not going to engage with the combat system at all unless I have to, and I ended up running past a ton of combat encounters. And I honestly think that helped me enjoy the game more, rather than trying to obliterate everything. It also allowed me to save ammo for when I needed it and engage more strategically. But even skipping like this, I was still running out of ammo constantly, so resource management is key. Just quickly before we talk story and then wrap up, I have more reviews over in this playlist. Watching more of my content is one of the easiest ways to support the channel, so head over and see if there's anything that takes your fancy. Okay, thanks. Pivoting now to talk about the Scorn story, or probably more accurately, lack of story, there is a world that can be built from the things the player will experience in this game. And that world will have lore and a series of events that probably happened, but all of the contents of that world will be things that the player has decided are their version of events that creates their own headcanon. In the same way that Scorn is not willing to put anything forward to aid the player understanding the gameplay, Scorn provides nothing in terms of building up a story or a narrative to engage with. The Steam page of Scorn describes the game as being designed around the idea of being thrown into a world, isolated and lost inside this dreamlike world, player activities. Scorn does have a few events, plot if you will, that persists from level to level, but attributing this to narrative would be stretching the term pretty thin. This doesn't mean Scorn has nothing to offer the literary type. The setting is so focused and draws inspiration so readily from the artist mentioned previously that many of the same themes are present. The player could use the framing of different parts of the game as a lens to consider questions about life, birth and rebirth, what it means to live or to create life, existence, etc. But again, it's up to the player to find that meaning because the game is adamant in not explicitly giving you anything. I also feel obliged to say that the ending will likely be one to split the room. Much like the combat system, it's going for something specific. The plot involves some bold choices, and it's a doozy. So I will just warn you to be ready for that one. There is a conversation to be had about the role of an ending and what it retroactively does to the rest of an artwork, but this review isn't the place for that. When it comes to my personal opinion, I mostly enjoyed my time with Scorn. I loved spending time in the world and engaging in each new puzzle. And while the game plays one note in the art direction, the colour of that note slowly shifts from zone to zone, meaning that there was always something to look at that was alien and foreign, but fresh and intriguing. And some of the combat is pretty fun, namely when you have the shotgun and the pistol and the game is throwing enemies at you within your means, and you have enough resources to reasonably engage them. But after I finished the game, I found that it didn't really leave me with much. I found myself burned on how little plot there was, and I didn't particularly like the ending, feeling that it trivialized much of the gameplay. And as a very goal-driven story gamer, I was left with feelings of frustration and disappointment primarily over appreciation for the art I had enjoyed and the puzzles that were well-paced and constructed. Ultimately, I found Scorn punched above its weight in the art and atmosphere. The world is so detailed and realized, the spaces are so alien and mesmerizing that exploring the world is an experience I haven't really had in a video game. The game had me looking up and around much more than I usually do to soak it all in, and if you can get a gamer to look up, you're succeeding at something. If you aren't there for the atmosphere and you really want there to be some gameplay to sink your teeth into or to tide you over, then I would say approach Scorn with a healthy dose of skepticism. While the world is worth seeing, the art is worth appreciating, and the grotesque nature of things offers a novel experience, the frustrating combat, health, and checkpoint systems, lack of narrative, and deliberately sparse scaffolding may prove more frustrating than the effective puzzle box and interface puzzles driving most of the exploration can overcome. Click all the things around the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.